And welcome to the Tier 2 Culturally Responsive Practices Family Interview webinar. My name is Kent Smith. I am a Regional Technical Assistance Coordinator for the Wisconsin RTI Center, covering CSIS 3, 4, 10, and 11. Also a part of the Wisconsin Culturally Responsive Practices team. I will be sort of doing the presentation this morning. Facilitating the room is Milaney Leverson, one of the other Wisconsin RTI Center PBIS techs. She will be watching the chat box and fielding any questions that you may have and type. So I will present and she will watch the room. And as we go through this, if you do have any questions, either please type them or make sure you take time to unmute yourself and you can kind of jump in and ask questions. The format for the morning for the session is going to be a short sort of review presentation of what the interview tool is used for, how it's used, and kind of overall the intent and what you can do with it, followed by some facilitated discussion questions at the end, and then any kind of networking or exchanging ideas that you may have. So that's kind of what we're planning, and we do hope to have you out of here by 10 o'clock. This session is also being recorded, and it will be hosted on the Tier 2 training material website as soon as we get all the hosting stuff taken care of. So, if you have not done so, please make sure to orient yourself to the control panel, the go-to training part. There's an example on your screen of what it looks like, how to adjust, mute, and unmute your audio, where you can find the material, and where you can kind of type any questions.
And everybody, I'm Milaney Leverson. I am a PBIS Technical Assistance Coordinator in the West region, supporting CSIS 4, 10, and 11, and a trainer. So glad to be here this morning.
Okay. So, with that, we are having a little bit of technology issues where you cannot raise your hand. We can't see it as we're running the presentation. So, please make a note that you want to ask a question, and I will unmute you. Okay, so the Culturally Responsive Practices Family Interview. The material, the PowerPoint, and the interview tool itself can be found at the link on the screen. We also have it in the materials section of this webinar for you to access. As we go through this, again, this is intended really as a conversation and not as a training, to kind of give you sort of that overview of how the material can be used and help stimulate your thinking. So to start, what we really want to think about is, why do we want to use either this interview tool or have conversations with families in general regarding our culturally responsive practices as a student is accessing Tier 2 support. And really the things to keep in mind are that the interview itself, either a written interview or phone interview face-to-face, however you choose to do it, provides additional information when a student is at the point of needing to access additional support. And the information that we're really looking for is the family's perspective and how they view the various aspects of culture coming into play with how the student has been experiencing success or concerns that have been noted within the Tier 1 framework. So what we teach, how we reteach, all those good things. The interview can help identify patterns as well for professional development needs at the universal level. So when we think about what our universal system looks like, we can think about things like, teaching our matrix and how we provide correction and reteach and use our acknowledgement system. But we also want to look at things like how the classrooms are imaged, the interactions between staff and students, sort of the values, the experiences that are on display in the classroom. Typically, if schools have not been doing a lot of attending to culturally responsive practices or are new to it, then what usually ends up happening is the dominant culture is on display, the teacher's culture, the school's culture, which tends to be kind of monoculture, right? It's sort of that dominant culture, dominant experience. And by having this interview in place, what we're able to do is start looking for trends. So if we all of a sudden start seeing a number of families that are saying, wow, I think socioeconomic status is kind of impacting how my child is experiencing success, or if race, or if language, or gender, disability status, all of these are things where the family can kind of say, yeah, I think there may be a little bit going on with this. This isn't intended, and we're going to talk about this in a second too, this isn't intended to sort of lay blame or fault find within the school. It really is intended as sort of a checkpoint on those universal practices and system components to help figure out what do we need to reinforce. The interview provides an opportunity to engage families to gain their perspective. Family engagement is one of those things that really has sort of evolved within the PBIS framework over the last probably 5 to 7 years. Schools that were initially trained, we talked a lot about family involvement. Do we have a family member on the team? Are we providing information to the families? Those good things. But what we want to be thinking about instead is, how are we engaging with the families? How are we getting families' voice, families' perspective in what we do? Essentially, schools leading with their ears and not leading with their mouths. The interview tool or the interview process provides an opportunity to sort of amplify those family voices as well, and try to identify gaps in service and how we can support students that are, by the family perspective, being underserved, which also may show up within our universal data. So we want to review always our framework and why this is important and kind of where this fits in. The universal system is obviously the part of our framework that all students, all staff have access to. It's that good first instruction. It's how our classrooms are imaged. It's how our classrooms and schools operate. It's how we teach and what we teach and how we provide error correction and how we build fluency. The protocol, the interview, is suggested where that star is, right? The recommended time to gather the interview information with families is when all students are identified as needing intervention. We're not talking about using this protocol with our students of color or our English language learner students or our students with disabilities. What we're really wanting to do is make sure that every single student who is identified as needing to access support, we provide this opportunity for feedback. We're wanting to sort of put a check and balance on our universal system, not only by looking at our ODR data, our minor data, all of our student outcome data, but we also really want to keep an eye on those family and student perspectives. So doing this at the threshold of entering support is kind of where we're recommending this happen. This is also important when we start thinking about the interventions themselves at Tier 2 and Tier 3. As you know, we want to have families engaged at the universal level because by the time we get to those intensive interventions, we really, really need to have partnership with the students and the families, that we are providing the interventions with them, that it's their voice, it's based on their cultures, their community. So if we're not engaging them at Tier 1 and we're not starting to listen to them and their concerns at Tier 2, they're certainly not going to be in place by Tier 3. So this provides another opportunity for us to start engaging families and getting their perspective on how well things are operating. So again, really this interview protocol can be seen as an extension of Tier 1, right? There's nothing that says you can't use this, first day of school or random checks throughout the school year to figure out, what's the family's perspective on what's happening. But for a lot of places, that's really kind of unwieldy to say we want to have family interviews with all 500 students in our building. So the idea is when we're starting to see a student demonstrate a little bit of risk indicator, a little bit of behavioral struggle, where they're starting to be identified as maybe needing a little bit of support, that's where we would use this interview protocol. This is, again, totally up to an individual school district to figure out where and when you want to use this, and even if you want to use this tool. But what we're really trying to do is put a system checkpoint in there and provide you with a method of starting to get family and student perspective in how well things are going. Because Tier 2 supports are really sort of intended for those students that are just beginning to struggle to identify a little bit of behavior support, then this seems to be a natural place rather than trying to have those family interviews for every single student, really saying, okay, so we know that the students are beginning to struggle a little bit with behavior. They're just starting to show up in that at-risk range. So let's start figuring out what's going on, rather than saying to the family, hey, we know what's going on. This is the issue. We're starting to get that family perspective. So again, this is suggested. This isn't a thou shalt do this. What we really want you to do is be thinking about how can we engage families for their perspective and in a way that is quick and convenient, and is a way that can serve to not only provide really support at Tier 2, but also reinforce Tier 1. The other thing to think about is when we start talking about Tier 2 supports and we start talking about things like check-in, check-out, and social academic instruction group and mentoring, if there is a disconnect between the student and the classroom at a universal level for cultural reasons, for poverty, for language, for race or ethnicity, then we also have to ask ourselves, if we don't pay attention to that, how is Tier 2, how is check-in, check-out going to really make a difference in behavior? Certainly what it's going to do is provide additional instruction, additional chance for practice, and additional feedback. But if there's a cultural disconnect, then all we're really doing is more of the same without attending to those cultural implications. So if we have a student who, for example, comes from a background that says overlap as a communication style is expected. So in the home, in the community, there is not this sense of taking turns when people are talking. If you're excited about something, if you've got something to contribute, you're going to jump in. At home and in the community, that's fine. That's awesome. That's what the student has been taught to fluency. It's how they communicate at home. But in the case of that cultural disconnect, when a student comes into the classroom and we're not paying attention to teaching the student to fluency the way it was taught at home, how to take turns in communication, or when overlap is appropriate and when it's going to interrupt instruction, the interventions aren't going to work, right? All we're going to be doing is saying, well, you did a little bit better today, but I really need you to focus on this. What this data is going to do is allow us to go back in and say, oh, okay, we really need to focus on teaching the student situational appropriateness. We really need to focus on when we need to teach the student to code switch. So it helps make the Tier 2, the Tier 3 supports more effective, while helping us to identify those necessary patterns from Tier 1 as well. And then, like we said, when we start thinking about those Tier 3 supports, these are individualized. These are for students who are experiencing kind of significant behavior concerns. And if we're not engaging the families from early on, it's going to be more difficult to engage them at Tier 3 when those relationships are absolutely essential. So that's a little bit about the intent and why we want to be thinking about doing this tool. The tool itself is really not hard and fast, right? This has been developed as an additional resource for schools as they go about implementing Tier 1, Tier 2, or refining and sustaining Tier 1 and Tier 2. And really, this is to guide your thinking. So what is the intent? Again, it's to collect the family's perspective or perception regarding the role that their culture may play in the school setting and how it may or may not impact the child's success. So what do we mean by that? So we may assume that because the family has never said anything to us about the language that they speak at home or some conditions that this child has medically, if it's not showing up in school, then we may not be attending to it. But in the family's perspective, the fact that their child has a medical condition or the fact that English is not the language that they speak at home may be contributing to how this child is experiencing success. So we can't assume, because the only context that we see the student in is the academic context. It's the academic setting. We may think that we understand, but we also know what happens when we assume certain things. So by having this interview process in place, we're sort of minimizing that tendency to assume, and we're engaging the family directly saying, hey, we want to do better. We want to make sure that we're kind of operating at peak efficiency and effectiveness. Do you have time to answer a couple questions? It allows the student to monitor their it allows the school to monitor universal systems in regard to culturally responsive practices. This isn't intended to assign blame. Any school that has been paying attention to culturally responsive practices over the last few years understand that the systems that we have in place were not developed overnight. The systems, the way that schools operate, the pedagogy, the way that we interact, the way that we operate, all of those pieces are sort of things that we've inherited over time. That what we started doing, because they've worked for the majority of students, we've continued to use. Because it's worked for the majority of staff, we've continued to use. And what we've done is really focused on the majority, right? That if it's working for the majority, then clearly it's working. And the sort of corollary to that is if it's not working for a few students, well, it's something with the students. And that's truly not the case. So what we're needing to do is really keep an eye on what we do and how we do it. It's not saying that we are deliberately going out of our way to target students. It is saying that we've been operating as a status quo. Now we need to pay attention to who are we not reaching, and now let's start attending to it. It engages families in two-way conversations prior to sort of those at-risk behaviors becoming chronic or intense. So what we're doing is saying, by putting it at that threshold to intervention, that threshold to tier 2, what we're saying to families is, okay, your student is beginning to struggle. The good first teaching that we've delivered, really, we need to do a little bit more. So we need your perspective. We know what we're seeing at school, but we also know that the student, your child, exists in other settings, in other environments. So what's your take on it? Help us fill in the picture. Help us see the whole child. What's your take? So it really is a way to engage, not a way to blame, not a way to sort of target. It's really a way to get their perspectives and help us check ourselves. So the practice interview has two parts. If you have downloaded it, if you've looked at it online, the first part is a cover sheet that talks about where the tool came from, what its evolution was early on, and what we've kind of done with it. It talks about the fact that it's an interview and when it's suggested to be used, but it's also not required, right? So what we're doing is providing the opportunity to the families to provide this information. It's not like what we're saying is if you don't do this, your child won't get support. That's not it at all. But what we are doing is saying any child that is identified as needing additional support, we would like families to have a chance to give us feedback. Early on when we were starting to pilot this, and as we had this in demonstration, use this with a lot of students entering intervention, and I can only think of 2 times where families said, no, I really don't want to do this. It's not required, but what we are asking is that you provide the opportunity for families to give this feedback. Again, the other thing to keep in mind is that this process should be used for any student who is identified as needing additional support. We are not saying that this is only used for students of color or from students who are English language learners or who, right? It's any student. What we're doing is making sure our universal system is reaching all our students. This is not targeted to a specific, enrollment group. So the cover page kind of goes into that. And it provides you an opportunity to explain to families how this works, why we're trying to do this, and give them the opt-out. The other thing for you to keep in mind is you have multiple ways of delivering this. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But essentially, your decision is how are you going to get this opportunity in the hands of the families? Certainly, you can send this. You can send it home with the student. You can send it home in the mail. You can do it as a phone interview. I've done this over the phone with a number of families. It takes about 5 minutes, so it's not this big time-consuming thing. You can also put it on your website. The caution that I have for you is making sure that it's not just delivered in a specific way. So saying that it's going to be a phone interview, well, what that's going to do is sort of limit access to any families who may not either have phones or may not be able to afford phones, or you kind of get the idea. When we start thinking about things like literacy, this is written at a relatively easy to read, easy to interpret grade level, but we also can't assume that every single family is literate or is English literate. So we want to make sure we have multiple opportunities. You know, they may be able to read Spanish very well, but may not be able to read English very well. These are the things you want to keep in mind. Do we have multiple points of access for it? The second part of the packet is the interview itself. And again, this is sort of yours to do as you wish. This was developed initially from early work that UW Green Bay, Madison Schools did. It's evolved over time. We went into pilot with it. We have had family advocacy groups look at it. We have had attorneys from NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Southern Poverty Law Center kind of reviewing it to see, you know, is it kind of getting at what we want it to? And it does. Some of the language may be stuff that your building or your district doesn't, you know, we don't talk about our universal as an intervention. We talk about it as universal. That's fine. You can modify the language. What we're really trying to do, though, is get at the family's perception of whether or not their student was taught to fluency, whether, you know, as concerns were starting to show up, the family was engaged in that problem-solving conversation, whether they think their, you know, family culture, language, heritage, you know, is impacting the fit between the student and the classroom. So it's yours to kind of tinker with the language as you see fit. What we're really trying to do, excuse me, again, is get the family's perception, not to cast blame. And this is it. As you can see, this is not a long tool. It's essentially, you know, a 4-point scale or a yes or no. So we're not asking for the families to fill out, you know, 200 questions that's part of a diagnostic evaluation. Once you've gathered the interview from the family, the information should be retained for use as part of the problem-solving processes needed for the student, right? So if you get a note from the family saying, yeah, I really think language is an issue, or socioeconomic status is a concern, then you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind to help make sure the Tier 2, Tier 3 interventions are working. Aggregate information, so not necessarily student-specific, but those overall trends that you're seeing, while we have a number of families that think socioeconomic status really is impacting how the student is experiencing success, now all of a sudden we have 10 families that are saying that same kind of thing. That's going to be the kind of information we want to be sharing with our universal system. So are we seeing that information transfer to professional development, reviewing information at staff meetings, things like that? And these tools at the end of the year can be destroyed. Again, it's just essentially a way for us to kind of check our universal and proceed accordingly. So anticipatory guidance. So as you think about how you're using this or how you want to get information from families, you know, the big things to keep in mind, that the tool is a way to monitor the system in addition to your outcome data, and risk ratio calculations. It's not a standardized tool. It's not something that you have to adhere to. It's a tool that was put into place to help these conversations happen. It's a conversation point to engage families. It's not diagnostic. It is not blame placing. It is not a way to, fault find. It's a conversation tool and a conversation point. And it provides some information that can start conversations if higher intensity support is needed. Again, it's not diagnostic and it's not set in stone. So if you use this tool, great. If you don't like the tool and you want to modify language, that's great. If you have another way of providing, getting access to that information and providing families the opportunity, that's perfectly acceptable as well.
I think that's an important point, Kent. I think when we use, we're recommending the use of this tool, really what we're trying to do is get schools to have a systemic way to look at having these conversations, and that's a big deal. So how can you systemically get parent voice or family voice into your system conversations? How can you make that happen? And like Kent said, this is one way that we found to do it, and it's one way that I think can work, but you have to make sure that you find a way that works within your system. So if this tool isn't it, then the need that you're trying to meet is to find a way to systemically evaluate sort of parent perception about your practices and how you're supporting your students.
So this is kind of where we want to first ask for questions, comments, concerns before we kind of move into the facilitated conversation. Want to make sure that people kind of understand the intent behind this and answer any questions that you have, because I think, early on, people may have been, depending on who trained or who kind of had this conversation with you, really just want to make sure that people understand what this is. So at this point, I can watch the control panel, and if you do have a question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. I can't do that while I'm presenting, but now that this is kind of a chance for questions, here we go. Okay, so Michelle asked, do we have a translated copy of the interview questions? There is a rough Spanish copy floating around somewhere. Essentially what we wanted to do, rather than invest into a very large library of these questionnaires, is really turn it over to schools and to districts where translation can happen for the communities that they serve. So do we have translated copies that are readily available? No. Do we have a draft Spanish one floating around? Yes. Again, it's going to kind of be up to a district to figure out who their communities are, if there's a particular dialect, what the language needs are that are out there. We did this initially with a number of families that spoke Farsi and Urdu. We didn't have translation for that standing by. We did use translators to do a phone interview. So given kind of what district needs are, the communities that they serve, the languages that the communities that they serve and families that they serve speak, that's kind of a local issue. But so I guess the short answer is not really. Good question, though. Thank you. Other questions, things we can clarify?
I think that point too about translating the interview questions is an important one. It kind of sounds like a cop-out for us at the Wisconsin RTI Center, but I think that's an important engagement point too for your communities and your families, because if you're already reaching out to say, okay, how can we translate what we're doing at Tier 1 PBIS so that our families understand it when they maybe don't speak the same language that most of our school staff speak, then you already have a place to ask this question about this survey. And I think it would really be important to say, we're not hoping to just put this through Google Translator, but what we want to do is get your feedback on how we could translate this so it means what we're trying to get across. And that could be a really good conversation point.
Yeah.
That's not to say that all schools have the time to do that or have the connections with the community or the family to do that, but I think it could be a really powerful way to engage a conversation around it.
And I think that's kind of a better way of saying what I was trying to get at. You know, if we all of a sudden translated something into Spanish, but we have students that are from a family or from a community where, you know, it's a different Spanish dialect, you know, then what we're doing is saying, okay, well, we're going to treat every Spanish speaker the same, as opposed to how do we make it relevant. Jennifer asked a question, is this a tool that you see classroom teachers facilitating with families as well as other staff? It's kind of a good question, depending on how comfortable your families are talking about things like culture. So there were some schools that piloted this early on where, yeah, the classroom teachers had those relationships, had been doing some of the culturally responsive work where, you know, it was just part of the relationship. It was part of the conversation. It was part of, you know, how are we making sure that your child, your family can see themselves in the classroom. There are other places where the whole idea of having a conversation around culture, around race, around poverty is a hard one, in which case, you know, the building needs to figure out a process that is going to be effective for your current climate, and then where do you want to go? So can it be done? Absolutely. Are we saying that it must be at a classroom level? No. It's going to be wherever feels the most natural, given where your school's culture and climate currently is and the relationships that exist with the families. Question came in, is this appropriate to think about the cultures other than ethnic in our schools when looking at the use and the results? Yeah. So keep in mind, when we talk about culture, and I kind of alluded to this early on, and the questionnaire, the protocol does the same thing. Culture is not just race. It's not just ethnicity. What we are trying to do is get at information that is available at an individual student level. So questions like socioeconomic status is certainly a culture. Language, you know, home language, community language is certainly a culture. If you have a large number of students in your building who may be LGBTQ, and that may be something that's impacting their success, if you have the ability to engage the students or families around sexual identity, that certainly is a culture. So what we're wanting you to think about is who are the cultures that you serve, and how can we open that dialogue with the students and the families around how that culture is either being validated and affirmed within the classroom, or how that may be impacting their ability to succeed. What we're looking for is those overall patterns at a universal level, and then how do we need to modify what we do to support the individual student. So when we talk about culture, again, think about this beyond race, think about this beyond sort of ethnicity that we typically think about. Culture is really, how does a person identify themselves? What are the various facets of themselves that impact how they interact, you know, with the settings, the environments around them. Anything you want to add with that, Milaney?
No, I don't think so. I think I didn't see that question pop up in the chat, so I was trying to remember where you started with it.
Sorry.
Sorry, that's okay. No, I just think it's important for us to think beyond race and ethnicity, and I don't know that people on this call have necessarily heard me on my soapbox lately, but my latest soapbox is that when we talk about the racial categories that are in our data, those are very broad categories, and they were defined a long time ago in 1997 by a department of the federal government that, you know, isn't known, I don't think, for being necessarily culturally responsive. So I think we want to be careful to not let those categories box us in, but to see those as an entry place for where we start having conversations and start digging deeper into what we know and what we need to know about our communities and the families that we're serving. So I think absolutely think about culture and ethnicity. I mean, think about the broad, like the more detailed aspects of that when you're thinking about your communities and and really try to get at all those pieces. I think the more we start to have conversations with families around these issues, the more comfortable they'll be talking to us about it. But that's going to take time, and it's probably going to be awkward in the beginning. And I think that goes back to the question earlier about, do we see classroom teachers facilitating this with families? And I think what Kent said was spot on. It really depends on the environment that you have set up at your school. I think there are a lot of classroom teachers that would not be comfortable having these conversations. And so we have to think about how we support them in that. We have to think about what we're already asking them to do to support our system. And then, is this something that we can add on to that? Or is this something that we need to add on while we take something else away so that they actually have time to do it? Or would it happen more naturally in a different setting or with a different person, with a different staff member in our building? So I think all of those things are really good questions to ask, but they're also really situation and environment specific. And you need to be very purposeful when you decide how and when you want to implement a tool like this, or even start having these conversations.
And I think that kind of gets to the difference between sort of technical and adaptive change as well. You know, what we're doing is giving you a tool and we're telling you, all right, so technically this is how to do it. But a lot of these questions are adaptive. So by understanding the intent, why are we doing this? What are we trying to do? That helps guide how you implement it. And again, if we're understanding this as a way to kind of engage dialogue, engage family perspective, increase family voice, that kind of helps guide how a school, how a district can take this tool and use it. So, you know, do be thinking about these things both in terms of technical, the tool, and the what and the how, but the why is the deeper. What are we trying to change in our school's climate and culture by using this?
Right.
And it's to enhance family voice and perception.
Well, and earlier, Kent, you mentioned that this could be something that you could do with every family, you know, if it were feasible in your building or within your setting. And I think it's important to note, too, that there is a middle ground between using this tool and not using this tool. So, like Kent said, this is something that you can modify and adjust. And if you see one piece of this or one chunk of questions that you want to know the answers to from every family, then take that chunk and investigate that. Find a way to get that information from your families and from your community members and use that. So again, there are ways to, it's not all or nothing, I think, with this tool. I think you need to think about, again, what's going to work in your environment, what's going to work in your setting, what do you want to know, what do you need to know as a team to make your system more responsive, and what's the most efficient, the easiest way to go about that so you're not putting an extra burden on your team or your staff.
Yeah. And actually, so here's the other thing to keep in mind as Milaney was talking that just dawned on me. For those of you that actually, you know, that use PBIS apps and use the surveys, there are going to be 2 surveys that are going to be added to PBIS apps within the coming months. One is a school or is a student satisfaction survey. The other is a family satisfaction survey. You know, if you have concerns about the wording, if you have concerns about the format of this, that's also going to provide another opportunity for you to have, you know, engage families and students with some of these same kinds of questions and dialogues. They're not available yet, but they will be coming out soon as just sort of another option. But again, the intent behind any of these is the same. How are we engaging the family, getting the family voice around culture and those good kinds of conversations. Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we move to the conversation piece? Okay. So my first question for you to think about is, how are you monitoring your universal system for disproportionality? This is, again, one of those things that has kind of evolved over time. And what I'm just kind of interested in is hearing where you're at and how this kind of conversation tool and protocol can fit into that monitoring setup. This also does provide us with good information for how do we enhance training, conference offerings, those kinds of things. So I am looking for a few people to contribute. Otherwise, I may pick on you.
They're probably all really just busy typing, Kent.
Yeah, actually, we just got one from Amanda Hughes. This is an overall question and not specific to the current question. Okay, that's cool. But we understand the benefit of gathering the system level data for our practices, but can you provide us a specific student example of how this interview process helped that student's intervention? Yeah, absolutely. So kind of some back history for you. Milaney and I worked together for a number of years in the school district. I'm a school social worker. Milaney was a school psych. And we worked together at several buildings, and we had a student who was in second grade who was really kind of struggling with what the teacher was calling disruptive behavior. And the process, there are a couple of aspects to this particular student situation, but one of the things that happened was there was a cultural disconnect. The student came from a country in the Middle East. When he was not in school with us in Wisconsin, he was back in the Middle East in school, and that's where he had initially started. So he was in year-round school. One of the things that was happening was that culture piece. So when the teacher would ask a question, the student was blurting out. And in doing this protocol tool with a family and trying to get the family's perception of culture in this, what we ended up finding out was it was a cultural mismatch. That when the student began attending school in the Middle East, the expectation was when the teacher asked a question, you answered. There was none of this hand raising and waiting your turn until you were called on. That was sort of seen as rude. That when an authority figure, when the teacher was asking you a question, you answered then. And that's what he had been taught, and what he had been taught to fluency initially. But in this particular school, in this particular state, the kid had to disconnect, right? So what he knew was getting him in trouble. What the teacher in Wisconsin wanted was for him to raise his hand and wait to be called on. And she kind of taught it once at the beginning of the school year, but wasn't able to teach it to fluency. And didn't know to teach it to fluency, didn't know what the student's prior learning was, what the student's culture was, what the student's prior experiences were. So this protocol helped do two things. One, it helped us figure out sort of what needed to happen differently, right? We needed to spend additional time kind of helping to teach that. We also needed to spend time building relationships with the student, because by the time we got involved, the student was really not wanting to come to school. It was feeling like a bad fit. He was feeling disengaged. The family was feeling disengaged. So it helped us kind of figure out what we need to do with the student, but it also helped focus on some of the things that we needed to address systemically. Anything you want to add to that, Milaney, since you know the kid?
Well, not specific to that situation, but I do think, and this isn't specific to students, but I think in many cases, the other thing the interview does is it lends a structure to a conversation that's really hard to have for a lot of parents, and I think for school staff. So I think for a long time our society has said things like, oh, well, they're playing the race card, which lends people to think, okay, if I say anything about my culture, the fact that I think my culture isn't being acknowledged, I'm going to be met with some kind of opposition. And I think this opens that door back up. So what I've seen with families, and again, this isn't student specific, but it's family specific, what I've seen with families is that they're actually relieved that we're opening that door again and starting those conversations, even if they don't have a complaint or they're not upset about it. It seems like it's a relief.
Yeah.
Because we're saying, okay, we want to know this. I mean, it's not, if you bring this up with us, we're actually going to listen, and I think that's pretty powerful.
Thanks. All right, so Jennifer answered the question, how are we monitoring universal system disproportionality, in the chat box. And for those of you that are on the phone, her answer was, if I meet with an African American male with an increased number of ODRs, I'll go into Swiss and pull up the ethnicity report and show that student the visual representation and talk about what disproportionality is, guide the conversation based on how that student responds to seeing that, and the parent, also used in parent meetings. Conversation piece, ask questions like, why do you think our numbers look like this at our school? Get the student's perspective on that, etc. And I think that that's a really good start to it, right? What we're doing is saying to a family that we're starting to see these patterns. What is it that we're missing? And that, I think, is the question we need to be asking ourselves constantly. How is our business as usual engaging or disengaging groups of students? The second part of, I think, what Jennifer's answer would be, once you get the family's perspective, is what do we do with that? So we're using the families as the experts on kind of the engagement, the disengagement. But then once we start understanding that, how do we translate that information to professional development, to changing kind of our system pieces to address those gaps? Jennifer showed those reports at staff meetings and asked the same question of staff and share what students and parents have said as well. Right, which gets us into sort of this concept of culturally responsive PBIS, which I think if you've not been hearing about it yet, you're going to be hearing more about in coming year, 2 years. It's a focus of the National Center in this current grant cycle. But that really is it. What we're looking for is that mismatch, is where is our current practice and our culture and climate engaging all students, and where are we disengaging them? And when we notice that disengagement, it's not a student issue. We cannot afford to continue to say, well, but it's because that family doesn't value education, or, well, those people don't value school. What we're needing to do is look at ourselves first, understanding that we have set up a system that benefits the majority. So I think that's kind of the right process to have in mind. Oh, and let the chat room say amen. Thank you, Jennifer. Anything you want to add, Milaney?
No, I don't think so. I'm curious about what their students and their families say about that data.
Yeah, I am too.
So Jennifer, if you feel like typing some more, let us know what some of the responses have been to some of these conversations.
Or we can unmute you.
Or we could unmute her.
Or if you would like us to get you off the spot, that's fine too.
Mm-hmm. I just think that's an awesome way to start the conversation of, how are things working? And at first, when I first started reading through the comment, the reply back, I was like, oh my gosh, what if they're targeting kids? And I got further in and I was like, wow, that's a really great way to say, hey, look at what we're doing and how is it working for you and why might it not be working for you?
I was thinking the same thing. And Jennifer says she'll type it. Thank you. Okay. It helps us to have conversations about what's happening on the larger scale in our community. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. There are things that we as practitioners see because of our frame of reference, and there's things that we don't. High rate of crime and violence among Black males here. Mm-hmm. Jennifer, where are you? Beloit. Cool, thank you. Beloit. Oh, we may be experiencing degraded audio quality. Awesome. We talk about how one student at a time can begin to change the perception. I think that's perfect. Was talking to somebody that supports St. Louis schools earlier this fall, and specifically supported a lot of high schools on the west side of St. Louis. And she was talking about the same thing, the fact that a lot of the students in West St. Louis, very close to Ferguson, wanted to talk about the things that were happening in the community. And it was very real for the students, and it was stuff that was weighing very heavily on the students. And depending on the school, they either engaged the students and families in conversation, or they sort of ignored it. And the schools that engaged in the conversations had much stronger relationships and were able to address kind of behavior concerns in a completely different manner, because they were understanding the things that were real and were very critical to the students' lives and the families' lives. So thank you. Then we also draw a connection to academics. Test scores drop out, it all comes together to honestly say you can be the first one to be different, whether among a peer group, a family, a neighborhood, whatever. It's empowering to students through honest conversations, building genuine relationships. Yeah. Yeah. How do we see the student? How do we see the family? How do we see their lives in relation to what we do? They're no longer sort of just a number. Anything, Milaney, you want to add to that, engage around?
Nope, I think I'm good.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. All right. So the second question, how are you getting family perception regarding culturally responsive practices right now? So I'll let you think about that and start typing replies. Michelle Graff just put a comment in there. The risk ratio calculator sets the white to 1 because it is comparing culture on display. Is that still accurate at a school that has 85% of their population Hispanic and only 3% white? Is that risk ratio calculator still valid when the educators are bilingual and educated in 2 cultures? Okay, so there is a different risk ratio calculator that we have available. Michelle, if you email me later, I can get that information to you, that will allow you to do between group comparisons. The risk ratio calculator is not, it's intended to identify pattern, trend. So if you're seeing a population with increased risk like Hispanic students in a school where the educators are bilingual, then you're going to be trying to figure out, okay, so we have an increased risk for Hispanic students, the teachers are bilingual, we don't think it's necessarily a language or a culture thing, so what else could it be? The risk ratio calculator is intended to begin the conversation. It's intended to say, ooh, pay attention here, to help guide the team into those what next. So is it still valid? Yes, because what we're looking at is what the overall discipline patterns are given your demographics. What you do with that is the different conversation. So it's sort of like going from a primary problem statement, we have a high risk of discipline contact, to a precision statement saying, okay, and what are those discipline contacts for? What are the settings that they're happening in? Who is involved with those? To help figure out that action plan. To provide sort of a cheesy cultural comparison, my family is from the South. I was born and spent a lot of my early years in Kentucky, where we had a lot of coal mines. And there was a colloquialism that we had that was that this is sort of the canary in the coal mine. So from a cultural standpoint, people in coal country understood that the canary was brought into a coal mine. If there were gases that built up, the canary died before the miners died, right? It said, ooh, something's going on. That's essentially what the risk ratio is. It's a canary in the coal mine. It's the thing that's saying, okay, something is going on here. Pay attention. You got to do something. So that's what the risk ratio is for. And how you use it guides kind of your team's work. So thank you for the question. If you want the one that's not set by default to white being the dominant enrollment, we'll get that to you as well. Anybody want to weigh in how you're getting family perception regarding culturally responsive practices? Okay. I think maybe in the interest of time, because we only have about 3 minutes left, I want to throw this question up there. What are the barriers that you anticipate or that you are concerned about regarding the use of this tool in your building? And just kind of use this as a jumping off point to kind of troubleshoot that. And while we wait for those questions or concerns to come in, Milaney, any wrap-up stuff you want to throw at them?
I don't think so. I think it's just The two things I think I want people to come away from this with are, one, that this is a way to think about how do we change our systems to meet the needs of our students instead of expecting our students to change. And then the other, that it's not an all or nothing thing. You don't have to implement the entire interview or not any part of the interview. There's a middle ground there. There's some room for compromise there where you could really have some good tools to evaluate your system if you just figure out what's going to work best in your own environment.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to honor people's time and their attention and understanding that you have work calling for you, we can kind of end the formal part of the conversation, and we can hang out if you want to engage us either verbally and not around all of these other strangers, or type it. But if you would like to leave, please feel free to go ahead. Otherwise, we will stay online for another few minutes. For those of you that are leaving, thank you very much for your attendance and participation. And for those of you that want to hang out, please stay on the line. And we do have 2 questions to address. One of those is in-house from Peg. Peg, yes, we'll have a conversation about that. Michelle Graff, we're going to need to work this into our systems and educate as to why we're doing this and how it's going to help us. Language is also a barrier. Yeah. Milaney, do you want to talk about that, or you want me to? I don't know if you can see it.
I can see it. I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think, earlier the question was asked, do we want classroom teachers to be doing this? And I think regardless of whether or not your classroom teachers are doing this, you need to provide some support to them around the fact that you're going to start having these conversations. So that's a very, very valid point. We need to do some education and provide some support before we can hold people accountable for actually doing this work. It's going to be difficult. It's probably going to be awkward in a lot of situations. So yes, absolutely. You have to have some really purposeful conversations about how you'll educate your staff, how you'll talk about this, how you'll educate your families on the fact that this is happening, how you'll get them involved kind of at the outset so that they're not caught off guard if they get a call about this interview or something like that. So I think that's a very valid point. You don't just want to leave this webinar and start calling every parent of every student that goes into Tier 2 and just asking them a bunch of questions without some kind of pre-work.
When we piloted it, Michelle, we did pilot. So what we did was, in one particular building, said that we are going to use this with, any student that met our data rules in grades 1, 3, and 5. And we learned from it. So we started small. We weren't focusing on specific demographic groups. We were focusing on specific grades and saying any kid that met the data rule, we would try this with. And we did have sort of a calling out of the blue, which got some mixed results. Initially, there was that alarm, why are you calling? But what we started tying it to was sort of that consent process. So when Timmy is nominated, there was a little bit of a follow-up that said, hey, and by the way, would you be willing to take 5 minutes to answer some questions? We're just trying to make sure that our system is working the way we want it to. So, if you have some of those concerns and barriers, what I would encourage is if you're not ready to do it full speed, which I more than understand, try some sort of pilot process to learn what works given the climate and the community and the culture that you serve, but make sure that you're not piloting it only with a specific cultural group, like, only the students with disabilities get this. What you're wanting to do is cast a wide net and get a cross-section. So by focusing on, like, any student meeting the data rule in a grade helps you understand what's working and not, and won't be perceived as targeting specific kids, especially as you're talking about the fact that this is a pilot. How do we scale it up?
Right. So Jennifer had a great idea too, maybe having the staff do the survey first, just showing them and having them work through it with a certain student in mind or their own child in mind or something like that, and how that could begin to guide their own practice if they knew that they were asking, that the school was going to ask parents these questions. I think that's a great idea.
I think that's beautiful. Any chance that we have to start these conversations with staff, because staff also have cultural backgrounds. And the more that we can get people to understand that we all have culture and that it's part of who we are and it's part of how we interact with the world, I think it takes some of the threat away. I think that's beautiful. For the people that are still on the line, Milaney, maybe what I'm going to do is unmute everybody so they can just kind of talk. I think we're down to about 12 people, so I don't think feedback will be an issue. Sound all right?
Yep.
Okay. For those of you that are still in the room, I am going to unmute you. If we start getting feedback and squawking, I will be muting again, and you can just raise your hand or type a question. All right, we are unmuted.
No, I've only done Kennedy.
Anybody else have any questions, comments? All right, I will give you 30 more seconds to weigh in. If not, we will end the webinar. All right. Thank you all for your time. And if you do have any questions, you can get a hold of either Milaney or I or your regional technical assistance coordinators through our website. Thank you all very much.